All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to NPA 610. I'm glad to see the vast majority of folks have made it into the classroom, so that's very good. We might have a couple people in the waiting room, so let's take care of that. Okay. All right. Well, I think we have just about everybody in, maybe one or two people left to join us. So again, welcome. I'm glad everyone made it into Zoom tonight. My name is Dr. Powell, and I'll be the instructor for this course, NPA 610. Hopefully everyone can hear and see me. Some of you, I'm sure, have used Zoom before. For some of you, this may be a new Zoom experience, but been using Zoom myself for several years now, and it tends to work relatively well, and I hope that you do enjoy it if this is your first time using Zoom. I thought what I'd do tonight is we won't do an entire class tonight, but what I thought we would do is talk a little bit about the course itself. I'll introduce you to some of the concepts we'll be covering in the course and give you a justification for why we are covering the concepts that we are covering, and how this course really is meant to provide a foundation for all the rest of the work that you do in the NPA program. As you may or may not know, this 610 course was recently redesigned, and it was redesigned to provide you with a more holistic view of the field of public administration, so you can better understand moving forward the role of a public servant, the environment in which public administrators operate, and how public administration really is rooted in the foundations of American government and American democracy. So the course today looks a little bit different than it looked a few years ago, but I think you'll enjoy the material. And again, I think the material will do a good job of preparing you well for success in the rest of the courses in the NPA program. But before we jump into a discussion of the course itself, let me just tell you a little bit about me and introduce myself. Again, my name is Dr. Powell, and I'm an adjunct instructor here in the Cal State Northridge program. My full-time position is department chair for the NPA program down at Cal State Long Beach. And this is my 10th year as department chair there, and my 20th year overall on faculty at Cal State Long Beach. Before I arrived in California, I was on faculty at Florida Gulf Coast University down in Fort Myers, Florida. Don't know if anyone's ever heard of Florida Gulf Coast, but when I went there, it was a brand new school. The only doors have been open for 3 years, and had the opportunity to start up a brand new MPA program and also started up 2 new bachelor's programs in political science and public affairs. So good experience, interesting experience in the swamps of Southwest Florida. But before I was there, I was at Eastern Illinois University for 4 years on their faculty in the Department of Political Science. Again, teaching primarily public administration, Congress, presidency, and a lot of courses in American government. So that is me, and this is the course. Hopefully you will be able to see on the screen. Let me clear a few things off my screen now to make it a little bit easier for me to see. On the screen, you should be able to see the syllabus. Everyone see the syllabus? Yes? All right, very good. Let me move a few things around. Okay, what I'd like to do is just start out talking about the course itself, some of the course requirements, and again, give you a rationale and a justification for why you are in this course and why this course should hopefully be very helpful for you as you move through the NPA program. I've got on the syllabus, hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at it. Our Canvas site is up and running, and all the documents and materials you'll need to be successful in the course are all located on that Canvas site. The syllabus is available there in a couple of different places for you as well. But if you haven't taken a look at the syllabus, let me just walk you through it briefly and hit some of the highlights and high points of the class. My best way to contact me, obviously, since we are all virtual as of now, is my email address. So if you need to contact me for any reason to talk about course material, or if you're having any problems turning assignments in on time, or you have questions about the material, feel free to send me that email. My phone number is on there too. That's my cell number. I'm much easier to contact via email. So I would say, by all means, try email first, and I'm usually pretty good at getting back to you quickly via email. Everything is online now through Zoom due to COVID. So I know that's going to be the case through the remainder of this spring semester. I know it's going to be the case throughout the summer semester. And then what happens in the fall, I think each campus and each program will be figuring out how they want to address the fall situation. But at least for the foreseeable future, for the next few courses, you will be completing those courses via Zoom. Let me take you through the syllabus, and we'll go through the table of contents quickly here and go right down to the meat of the matter. Course description. Now, the course description is changing. I know it's going through the curricular process now, so the new course description is a bit lengthier than what I have here on the syllabus, but I think this brief description does a pretty good job of telling you what the course is all about. It's really designed to introduce you to the major areas within the field of public administration. And two main things that we are trying to do in this class is, number one, to allow you the opportunity to take some of the concepts and the theories that we cover here in this class and apply those in a relevant and appropriate way to your own work experience and to your career. You know, an MPA program is both a graduate level as well as a professional program. As a graduate level program, we have certain scholarly types and academic types of requirements for you and the work that you submit. But it's also a professional program, which means that we always have to keep our eye on the nexus between theory and application. So you always be able to take this information and apply this information in an appropriate way in the workplace. And so that's one thing we're really looking for, is that nexus between theory and practice. The second important part of that description is that this course is meant to introduce you to the political, social, and economic environment of public administration. We will spend a lot of time looking at what it means to be working in a public administration environment. We'll talk about the political environment, the social environment, the economic environment, and how the unique environment of public administration has a major impact upon what we do and how we do it in the public sector. Let me just check one thing really quick. Okay, just making sure we're still recording. Course learning objectives, I've listed those on the screen for you as well, so you can look through those at your leisure. There are only 4 of them. Required textbooks. We have 2 textbooks for this class. The first one is by Don Kettle. I've taught this type of a class for probably upwards of about 25 years now. Use a variety of different types of textbooks. I really like Don Kettle's book because I think it really does do a good job of emphasizing the importance of the environment of public administration. So the Kettle textbook is going to serve as our primary textbook for the course. Now, even though it is the primary textbook, I do want to caution you to something, and that is, I don't always follow the textbook. In fact, I usually do not follow the textbook. I think if a course is serving its purpose, you learn from 3 different sources. You'll learn from your textbook authors. Hopefully, if I do my job right, you'll hopefully learn something from me. And then number 3, you'll learn from each other. If I just completely taught out of the textbook, there would be no reason for us to have these weekly Zoom sessions. So I really look at the Kettle textbook as our primary text, but it will guide our discussions, but it will not take the place of our discussions. Now, the Kettle textbook, I know there's a new edition, a 2021 edition of Kettle. Which edition you use is completely up to you. So if you want to get the brand new edition, you can do that. If you want to use an older edition, like I have on the syllabus, the content of the edition is pretty much the same. And that's one of those secrets of academic publishing, is that whenever new textbooks go into a new edition, those new editions, the content of the new edition is going to be pretty equivalent to the content of the previous edition. So you can use whatever edition of the Kettle textbook you would like. Then the other textbook we're going to use is the classics text, and that's by Shafritz and Hyde. I think maybe Steve Ott is on that one now too, but Classics of Public Administration. It is a collection of classical articles in the discipline of public administration. And I assigned that book because I want you to have the opportunity to read these classical articles yourself, form your own opinions about these articles, rather than just listening to what I have to say about them and just listen to my opinion on the articles. So it gives you some firsthand exposure to some of the classic articles that really formed the field of public administration. Some of those articles are relatively old. The oldest one goes back to 1887 with Woodrow Wilson. So some of the language might be a little stilted. Some of the content may be a little out of date. But I think the basic theories and the basic ideas we get from those articles really will give you a good idea of why we have this field known as public administration. All of our sessions will be on Wednesday evenings starting at 6 o'clock via Zoom. And you know that because I think everyone is here now, so you know how to get into Zoom, which is a very good thing. Some boilerplate information about online discussions. You can read through that on your own. I won't waste your time tonight going through it. My computer's a little slow tonight. Course requirements. Let's talk a bit about the types of assignments you're going to be doing in this class and what I'm expecting you to do in those assignments. Now, we're an 8-week class, and so it's kind of a truncated schedule compared to a normal, traditional 16-week semester. And I take that into account when I design the class so that we cover all the same information in an 8-week class as we would in a 16-week class, or like down in Long Beach, my distance learning program has 6-week courses. Regardless of the length of our semester together, we will cover the same information. It's just we cover it a little bit quicker in an 8-week class as compared to a 16-week class. But I also recognize that in an 8-week class, you have other demands on your time. This isn't the only thing you're doing. I know that you have work demands, you have demands from your family life, plus you have school. So I try to be realistic in the number and the amount of assignments that I use in my courses. So for this class, what we have is we have 5 different categories of assignments. First, you'll have a midterm assessment. The midterm assessment, I don't call an examination because it's not an examination, it is an assessment. Meaning that in that assessment, what I am looking for is I am not looking for right or wrong answers. I am looking for you to select an answer and provide me with an answer that is appropriate to the situation and that you justify well. So your answers on the assessments, whether it be the midterm or the final, those answers will be graded based upon your ability to justify your answer. So the way in which these assessments will work is I will provide you on each assessment with 5 scenarios. These are original scenarios that are meant to be reflective of the real world of public administration. I hate the term real world, but you get the idea of practical situations in public administration. For each one of those scenarios, you will then have 2 questions for each scenario, so a total of 10 questions on the assessment. In those questions, I will be asking you to take information that we covered in class and apply it appropriately to fit that scenario. So, for instance, we'll in the second half of the semester on our final assessment, we'll have a managing fiscal resources type of scenario on the final. In that one, I'll give you a hypothetical situation about a city that is struggling with its budget process. In one of the questions, you will need to recommend to me the type of budget format, and we'll cover all the budget formats when we get to that portion of the class. But you'll need to select one of the budget formats that we talk about, and then you'll need to tell me why that budget format is the most appropriate one to solve the problems and address the problems that the city is facing in putting its budget together. It will be graded based upon how well you justify your answer. Now, could you select, is there only one of the budget formats that works? No. I mean, there are 2, 3, maybe 4 of them could all work in that scenario. But what I want you to do is I want you to justify why the one that you selected is indeed the most appropriate one to use for the scenario. So that's the idea behind the assessments. We will not be doing them in class. In fact, if you've been on the Canvas site, and I made a couple little edits to the midterm and the final, but they are already there. And so if you go onto the Canvas site, the midterm assessment's available to you, and even the final assessment is also available as well. And you can start working on those whenever you see fit. You can then work on those at your leisure, how your schedule permits. And I think that's a little bit more realistic of a way to approach assessments in a graduate professional program. as opposed to having you sit here for 2 hours and do a quote unquote closed book type of examination. So you'll have one of those midterm assessments and you'll have one final assessment due at the end of our semester together. In addition to the midterm assessment and the final assessment, you will then have weekly Canvas postings. And I say weekly postings, they're not really weekly, in that there are 5 graded postings that you'll be doing throughout our course. It's an 8-week course, you have 5 postings. But these Canvas postings will utilize discussion board for those. And I post a initial prompt for you. You then go in and you respond to my initial prompt. You then provide responses to at least 2 of your classmates. Now, the prompts are always very brief, and I can show those to you a little bit later on tonight. But your response to my prompt in discussion board in these Canvas posts should be parsimonious, should be concise. So we're really looking at maybe about 3-4 paragraphs or so. And I think that would certainly be sufficient for responding to that initial post. Your responses to 2 classmates, and those responses, they can be even more concise. You can handle each one of those response posts in about a paragraph, and that should probably get the job done. So you have 5 Canvas posts with responses. Each one of those worth 30 points total for 150 points for your Canvas post, 100 points for your midterm assessment, and another 100 points for your final assessment. Then the final category of assignment is this policy paper. Now, again, we're very interested in this class at the ability to take information and apply information appropriately in practical settings. So you'll be doing a policy paper. Well, oops, sorry about that. So what are we doing in the policy paper? The policy paper, what we will be doing is you will be selecting a policy or a program. Now, we'll talk at length later on in the term about the substantive difference between public policies and public programs. But for our purposes here, when you think about a policy is the overarching approach. So you might have housing policy or welfare policy or defense policy. That's the overarching umbrella approach. Within that overarching policy approach, we then have public programs that help to fulfill the goals of those types of policies. So we may have housing policy. Within housing policy, we may have a program like housing vouchers. Or within welfare policy, we may have a program like temporary assistance to needy family grants. What I'm looking for you to do for this paper is to focus on a policy or program. Usually what you want to do is narrow it down to maybe the program level. Focus on maybe temporary assistance to needy family grants, or focus on for education of at-risk youth, maybe midnight basketball programs, whatever the case may be. A policy or program that you are familiar with or that you are interested in. And you will take that policy or that program and create a policy paper in which you do the following. Number 1, provide me a section where you describe the policy or program to me. Tell me about the policy or program, what it is, where it came from, its background, its purpose, what it's around for. Give me then a very brief type of description. Now, there's a good chance I'll probably be familiar with the policy or the program. Perhaps I won't. And you'll have to educate me about what the policy or program is all about. After you describe the policy or the program in the paper, the next section is where you discuss how the policy is influenced by the institutions of American government. And time permitting, which I believe we will have time permitting tonight, in the last part of class, we will go through the foundations of American government, just kind of as a refresher if you haven't had American government in quite a while. And we'll talk about the institutions of American government. So in this section, when you're talking about your policy or your program, tell me, did it originate in Congress? Did it originate out of some enabling legislation passed by Congress? Did it originate in a state legislative body, a House or a Senate? Was it something that originated out of an executive order? that was given by a president or by a governor. So again, how do executive, legislative, and judicial institutions, how have they influenced the nature of this policy or this program? Then the next section, we're going to get into some more of the functional elements of public administration. So in this next section, you're going to discuss the budget and finance challenges associated with the issue. So has this policy or this program been starved for resources? Is it short on resources? Does it need more money in order to operate? Perhaps it's gotten plenty of money in appropriations, but talk about the financial aspect of the resources required by this policy or by this program. Talk about some of the personnel or civil service regulations that affect the policy. Think about who's implementing this policy. Is this policy being primarily implemented by federal civil servants? Because if so, as federal civil servants, they have certain types of protections that at-will political appointees do not have. So who's making the decisions about this policy? Civil servants, or are the decisions being made primarily by political appointees? Think about the organization that's implementing this policy or this program. So what type of organization is doing the implementation? Is this being implemented by a commission? Is it being implemented by a large executive level department? Is it being implemented by a state agency? Is it being implemented by a paramilitary organization like a police department or a fire department? So talk to me a bit about the organization that is involved in implementing this policy or this program. And then finally, for this section, talk to me about the models of decision-making that are most appropriate for this policy. As we go through the class, we will have a section of the class when we talk about policy analysis where we discuss different models of decision-making. And I'll introduce you to rational comprehensive decision-making and incrementalism, mixed scanning model of decision-making, garbage can model of decision-making. So in this section of the paper, you'll be telling me which model of decision-making do you think is most appropriate for this policy or for this program. So in that third part of the paper, we're really getting into the functional aspects of public administration in regard to the specific program or the specific policy. Then the fourth section of the paper, you're going to give me a discussion of recommendations that you think would improve the program or policy. So some specific ways, maybe a couple of specific ways that you think the program or policy could be improved. So, could we streamline implementation? Maybe we want to reduce the number of organizations that are involved in the implementation of this policy or this program. Maybe the program would benefit from additional resources in certain types of areas. Maybe there needs to be additional professional expertise on the part of the implementers of this policy or this program. So just give me a couple of recommendations from you. These are your ideas of how you think you could improve the policy or the program. A conclusion, and then obviously a reference page for any resources that you are using in constructing the paper. Now, this is kind of a quasi-research type of assignment because I really want you to have some experience here in 610 going through some public administration journals and getting acclimated to the type of literature that we tend to use in the field of public administration. So I'm asking that you use a minimum of 10 scholarly resources in putting your paper together. The scholarly resources I'm referring to should be articles out of peer-reviewed journals. And to help you a little bit in terms of selecting the journals that you want to use, I've included a link under week number 1 of our course on our Canvas site with a sampling of some of the more popular public administration journals. Things like Public Administration Review, otherwise known as PAR. PAR, Public Administration Review, you will find out is kind of the granddaddy of them all when it comes to peer-reviewed public administration journals. So if you're pulling articles out of PAR, you know that you're using good scholarly peer-reviewed articles. Some others, Public Personnel Management. If you're dealing with a human resources personnel issue, PPM is a good scholarly, peer-reviewed public administration journal. If you're dealing with some finance issue, Public Budgeting and Finance is the #1 public administration budgeting journal that's currently out there. If you're dealing with intergovernmental relations, how national, state, and local level governments interact with each other on a given issue or a given policy, there's a journal called Publius, Publius. Publius is the Journal of Federalism, and that's kind of the top line journal, if you will, for intergovernmental relations. But I provide you with a link, and you list all those types of journals, and hopefully you should be pulling your articles from those types of journals. Now, the important thing about a scholarly article is we consider it to be a scholarly article if it is published in a peer-reviewed journal. A peer-reviewed journal, if you haven't come across peer-reviewed journals before, a lot of you probably have used them, but for those of you who haven't, a peer-reviewed journal means that all the articles that appear in that journal have gone through a blind refereed process, meaning that the author of the article submits the manuscript to the journal. The editor then takes that manuscript and will distribute it to a group of reviewers, usually 3 or 5 reviewers, with no identifiers of the article. So the reviewers who get the article have no idea who wrote the article, their organizational affiliation. It's a completely blind process. The reviewers then review the manuscript. They will provide feedback to the editor. The editor will then probably provide that feedback back to the author in what's called a revise and resubmit. The author then revises the manuscript and resubmits it again. Goes through the blind refereed review process again. Author may get some more comments to work on, may make another revision, and so on and so on. So when the article finally gets accepted for publication in that journal, it has been reviewed by at least 3 to 5 professional reviewers in addition to the editor of the journal. So we have good assurance, if you will, that once that article gets published, it is good, quality, valid, credible research. Those are the types of articles we want to use, not only in this class, but throughout the entire MPA program. So make sure your articles are coming from those peer-reviewed types of journals. If you find an article in a journal that the title is not listed in the link that I provided for you, that's fine. You can find out on your own whether or not that's a peer-reviewed journal. And the way to do it is go to the publisher's website. And on the publisher's website, the publisher will provide prospective authors with, here are the submission requirements for a manuscript. Just make sure it's reviewed. It's a blind referee process, and it's reviewed by multiple reviewers. Then you have yourself a peer-reviewed journal. So make sure all 10 of those articles you're using come from peer-reviewed journals. Put your paper in APA format. Now, I'm not a huge stickler on APA. I always say if it looks and tastes and feels like APA, it's close enough to APA for me. So I'm not going to ding points off for missing a little nuance with APA, but try and get it kind of in APA style, because a lot of your future professors will be sticklers with APA format. There is as you probably noticed, all these different sections, there are percentages associated with each, so you can kind of see how I'm weighting the grading. 10% for description, 20% for the institution section, 20% for the functional section, 20% for the recommendation section, 10 for the conclusion, 10 for your references, and then there's also a 10% quality of writing component for the paper as well. So do make sure that when you turn in the paper, it has been proofread, that it doesn't have grammatical or typographical errors. I do tend to go through and catch those where I can. So do make sure that it is a clean, final version of the paper that you are submitting. Again, the whole goal of this assignment is to just allow you, again, to find that nexus between theory and practice, and allow you to do it by focusing on a policy or a program that you find interesting or that you have some familiarity with. Now, as you think about the policy or program that you'd like to use for the paper, feel free to send me an email. and say, this is what I am thinking about doing, and I'm more than happy to provide you with some feedback, let you know if it's worked well in the past. Usually the feedback that I give is, this will work just fine, go ahead, you have my blessing. Sometimes you get feedback that, well, we might want to think about narrowing it down a bit, because sometimes the policy tends to be a little bit vague. So if you come to me and you say, I want to do something on housing policy, I'm going to say, okay, let's narrow that down. Is there an aspect of housing policy or a program within housing policy that we want to focus on? Because usually the better you can narrow it down, the better focus you'll have in doing the assignment. But this is really your research writing assignment for the class. So to recap, you've got 2 assessments, a midterm assessment and a final assessment, each one of those worth 100 points. So you can work on those throughout our semester together. You have 5 Canvas essays, each one of those worth 30 points. And the way in which I will assign points is, for your initial response to my prompt, that initial response is worth 20 points. Each one of your responses to a colleague are worth 5 points each. So you add it all up, you get 30 points for each one of your weekly Canvas essays. So that's 150 points, and then 100 points for the policy paper. Grand total of 450 points across those assignments. Any initial questions about those assignments? Again, we'll get into it more as we move through the class, but anything initially on this? Let me pull up our chat, make sure I'm not missing anything. Yes, Canvas essays are supposed to be between 3 and 5 paragraphs. Correct? Yes, that is correct. They usually tend to be 3 or 4 paragraphs, but yeah, 3 to 4 paragraphs certainly will get the job done. One thing that we'll focus on this class is we focus on the idea of parsimony. Be as parsimonious as you can. Say what you need to say using as few words as you can. And I think that's something that's true across the entire field of public administration. I learned that the hard way. Coming into graduate school, I was an undergraduate major in political science and history, and tended to write more like a historian than I did a political scientist. So I learned the hard way. Okay, let's see. In text chat, we also have, can we use personal anecdotal experiences in the policy paper? You can. I usually caution people to stay away from first person if possible, because you're not going to be able to use first person in a lot of the papers you're going to do in the program. But yeah, if you have anecdotal personal experiences with a program or a policy, you can certainly include those. First essays due next week? No. The first thing that's due next week is your introduction. I'll go through the schedule of all the assignments, but I give you a little bit of a breather in the first couple weeks before you have to turn in that Canvas essay that's being graded. Hard due dates, yes, there are. And I'll go through the syllabus as we cruise down through the syllabus. I made a couple of adjustments to the syllabus in the past couple days and uploaded a new version just with some of those hard and fast due dates in there for you. So we'll do those in just 1 second. Okay, I've already talked about the assessments. Each assessment has 5 scenarios, 2 questions related to each scenario, so you know about that. I've already talked about the Canvas essays. You have 5 of those. You respond to my prompt, and then you respond to 2 of your colleagues. 3 to 4 paragraphs is usually sufficient for the initial post. Each response to a colleague you can certainly do within a paragraph each, so those are very brief. Little grading scale there for you. So as I said, again, the initial post is worth 20 points, 5 points for each of the response posts, so a total of 30 points for your Canvas essays, your initial post plus your 2 response posts. Letter grade allocation, that is from the university, so that's not mine. This is what the university does. However, one thing I will tell you is, because I tend to try and be a very nice guy, if you give it what I call the old graduate school try, and that you turn everything in on time, if you come 1 percentage point below a grade, you will then get that boost of that extra percent. So if you come in 1% off of an A grade, you'll get the A grade for the course. So let's make sure to turn everything in on time, and things tend to work out very nicely in that regard. Another quick question in text chat about the books. Yes, you can use other versions if you would like. Whatever edition you want to use, you can. The only thing that I would caution you on is with the classics text. If you're using an older edition of the classics text, that's absolutely fine, but make sure that the assigned articles in the syllabus are available in that edition that you are using. Because every now and then when they come out with new editions of the classics text, they will drop an article and replace it with another article. So just make sure all the required reading are found within that edition that you are using. But usually those changes from one edition to the next are really, really minor. So it's usually not an issue. I'll let you read through the general grading criteria on your own. So course schedule, this is where we'll get to what we are covering, when we're covering it, and some of our hard and fast due dates for you. So tonight's our first class, obviously January 27th. And the way I've designed the class, since we have Wednesday evening Zoom sessions, is I've designed our week to run from Wednesday to the following Tuesday. And I've done that for every week except for the last week of the class, because I want to give you a couple of extra days to turn in your final assessment and get the class all wrapped up. But typically our week will run from Wednesday to Tuesday. So we're starting off tonight on the 27th with our Zoom session. We're just covering the syllabus, talking about course requirements. Then the second half of class tonight, we will talk about the foundations of American democracy as they pertain to public administration. So again, give us a firmer footing to understand constitutional rights and institutions of government and the political environment in which we operate in as public administrators. Now, I know you probably haven't had an opportunity to review the Constitution and that for a while, but the Constitution, Articles of Confederation, some Federalist Papers, those are all available for you on our Canvas site. And so I would ask that you go ahead and take a look at those for next week. We will cover the foundations of American democracy tonight, but we'll probably hold off on our examination of the Constitution until next week to kind of give you a chance to take a look at the Constitution again before we go through and parse it and pull it apart like we will do next week. So you'll see for each week you've got your readings and any relevant assignment. So for this week, the relevant assignment is your introduction post on Canvas. That is an ungraded post. So all you're going to do is go into the introduction, click on the introduction link, and in that form, just tell me a little bit about yourself. And some people have already done that. I think we have maybe 10 or 12 posts already, where you just tell me about yourself, tell me why you're in the program, maybe where you work if you want to, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. And so that will be your assignment that will be due by February 2nd. But again, it's not graded, so just a paragraph on you. Then next week, the February 3rd, we'll have our Zoom session. And to prepare for next week, we're going to spend most of our time next week talking about accountability and ethics. Now, we will carve out some time at the beginning of class next week to catch up on the Constitution after you've had a chance to take a look at it. And we'll go through the Constitution and pull out some of the relevant parts of the Constitution for our work as public administrators, and do that kind of in the first half of class next week. But then the remainder of the class and the lion's share of time next week, we'll spend on accountability and ethics. We'll talk about the basis of accountability. We will talk about why accountability is different in the public sector as compared to the private sector. And some people refer to it as ethics shock when they go from a private sector organization to the public sector, because all the extra accountability mechanisms, all the additional transparency that you have in the public sector as compared to the private sector. We will talk about the meaning of public service and why the meaning of public service really leads us to a higher level of accountability in the public sector. And we will then also go through the ASPA Code of Ethics. And we'll go through those codes one by one and talk about what they mean for public administration. Kettle Chapter 1 then is due for that week, so read that. And then you have one article in the classics text, the Bennington and Moore article called Public Value. We probably won't spend a lot of time talking about that article from the classics text, so just kind of give it a quick read, but you don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it. And then you have your first graded Canvas essay due. That is due on February 9th. So that will be due on the Tuesday before our next Wednesday class. Yes, the introductory post in this one is it's specific just to this course. And so you can certainly, the one that you used previously, you can always repurpose that if you'd like, but it's just an idea of, so I can get a idea about who you are and why you're in the program and what you're hoping to get out of the program. So that's all we're doing just for this introductory one. But again, your first graded one will be Canvas essay number 1, and that will be due then again on February 9th.
Professor?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, for the Bennington and Moore, will that be posted in the journal in Canvas through the link, right?
No, that's in the classics text. That's in the Shepard text.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And again, that one just, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. So give it a really quick perusal, but don't get too hung up on it because we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it next week. Some of the other articles in the classics text we will focus on and we will spend some time talking about. Then we move into week 3, and we'll have our Zoom session on that Wednesday as always. And then we'll talk that week about the scope of government. We'll get into the differences between public and private sector organizations. We'll talk about the different size and scope of public sector versus private sector. And here is where we will get into a classic article that we will spend some time on. So you read chapter 2 in Kettle, and then I also want you to read the Graham Allison article on public and private organizations. He asked a very interesting question. That question is, are public and private sectors alike in all, fundamentally alike in all unimportant respects? Basically meaning that are they similar in things that we really don't care about, but in the aspects that are really important, are there substantial differences between the two? So this is one I do focus on in our class in 2 weeks, and we will spend time talking about Graham Allison's article, so please do make sure to read that one. And then you'll have your Canvas essay that will then be due again on that Tuesday before our next Wednesday session, so that will then be due on February 16th. Then we'll get into week 4, have our Zoom session on that Wednesday. We'll do administrative structure and theory. We'll get into the question of what is public administration, and hopefully have a good discussion about whether or not public administration really is an academic discipline. And you might think, well, I'm in a Master's of Public Administration program, so obviously it's an academic discipline. But there are a lot of people who argue that it's not. A lot of people argue that public administration is really more of a subfield of a discipline like political science, but it's really not its own standalone discipline. Well, we'll have that discussion. We'll talk about what makes for a discipline. We'll talk about whether or not public administration is a discipline. And if it is a discipline, some of the implications of considering it to be a discipline and a standalone field of study. And then if we do come to the conclusion that it is a discipline with its own theories, we'll then talk about what those theories are. And we'll walk through the development of the theories of public organization. And we'll start with the classical school. We'll go through the human relations school, human resource management school, systems theory, and I'll introduce you to all the different schools of thought that we have gone through in trying to understand public sector organizations, with an emphasis based on the evolution of that thought and how we got from the classical school in the late 1800s to more modern schools of thought that we deal with today. So you've got readings in Kettle, chapters 3 and 4, and then you do have 3 articles from the classics text. You have Woodrow Wilson's The Study of Administration, and we'll obviously add some caveats to Wilson's legacy when we get to a discussion of Wilson. But despite all of those caveats, Wilson is still, his article is still considered to be the beginning of the study of public administration. And so that's why we still cover it. We'll talk about his politics administration dichotomy that you've probably run into before if you had any undergraduate courses in public administration. And we'll talk about why it's really less of a dichotomy than it initially looks like. We'll read Max Weber and his article on bureaucracy, kind of give us an introduction to the classical world of studying public organizations. And then you'll also read Mary Parker Follett, one of my favorite authors, as kind of a pre-human relations type of author. But those are the 3 articles that you'll be reading for that week out of the classics text. And then you have Canvas essay number 3 that is due along with the midterm assessment. So Canvas essay number 3 and the midterm assessment are both then due on February 23rd. Now, when are they due on that day? They're due by midnight. So as long as they're turned in by 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m., they are going to be considered on time. So you have the entire day as well on the 23rd before you have to turn them in. So all due dates are always by midnight. Then we'll move into week number 5. And week number 5, if I can get my syllabus to stop moving, we'll do public policy analysis in the executive branch. We'll talk about the public policy process. We'll talk about decision making and how policies really emanate from decision-making models. And we'll introduce those 4 different decision-making models and talk about how those work. And we'll have a discussion about this term effectiveness, because we have been trying to reform the public sector at the federal, state, and local levels for decades. And we've always tried to reform government to try and make it more effective. Well, what do we mean by effective? And we'll get into a discussion of what we mean by effective, how we can measure effectiveness, and I'll introduce you to 4 different models of effectiveness that we'll talk about and do a little comparison of those 4 different models and when each model is an appropriate measure of effectiveness in the public sector. You've got chapters 5, 6, and 10 in Kettle that you'll be reading, and then John Kingdon's very famous article out of his Agendas and Alternatives book that comes out of the classics text. Canvas essay number 4 will then be due that week as well, so that will be due then on March 2nd. Then we'll move into March 6th. March 3rd, that Wednesday, we will have our Zoom session, and we'll talk about administrative reform and civil service. We'll talk about theories of reform. We'll talk about the eras of public employment, and we'll take a journey through the era of gentlemen, the era of spoils, and the era of merit. We'll talk about why we saw those 3 eras and what those mean for the way in which we staff government. We'll talk about public employee unions and the influence that public employee unions are having now on what we do and how we do it in public organizations. Chapter 7 and 8 in Kettle, and then an article, NPR article in the classics text. That National Performance Review article, the NPR, it's not National Public Radio, it's National Performance Review. That article, we probably won't spend a whole lot of time on, so that's another one you can kind of give a cursory look at because we're really not going to spend a lot of time on it. And then your final Canvas essay is due that week as well, so that will be due on March 9th. Then week 7, March 10th, Wednesday, we'll talk about managing human resources and managing fiscal resources, really getting into those functional aspects of what it means to do administration in the public sector. Our readings will be Kettle, chapter 9 and 11, and then you'll have a couple articles out of the classics text, the James Perry article on motivation and the Alan Schick article on budgeting. The following week, we don't have class because that is spring break, and so there'll be no classes that week. It's kind of clunky to have spring break that late in our class together, but we can't control it. It is what it is. So we'll have our final session then on March 24th. That's our final week of class. Measuring performance in the public sector and the future of public administration, chapter 12 out of Kettle. And then I'm giving you until that Friday, the 26th. So you have a couple of extra days beyond our last day of class to turn in your final assessment and to turn in your policy paper. So just for your planning purposes, I made this change to the syllabus, so I went ahead and put in all the due dates for you for your handy reference. So midterm assessment due on February 23rd, final assessment due on March 26th. Policy paper also due on March 26th. Canvas number 1, February 9th, Canvas 2, February 16th, Canvas 3, February 23rd, Canvas 4, March 2nd, and the final Canvas then on March the 9th. So you don't have anything coming up for next week. It will be the following week when Canvas number 1 will be due. The only thing for next week is just your ungraded introduction post. Let's see, a couple questions in text chat. Let me catch up with them real quick because I've been droning on and on. Recommend get the books on Amazon, or another site that sells books. Any site where you can find it, the books that are relatively inexpensive. You certainly can get them off Amazon. You can get them from publishers' websites. If I don't know if you're renting books, but you can also rent them as well. And there's Chegg and some other places that will allow you to rent books. So I would say if you get an older version, but all the articles are in the older version, the classic sex, go ahead and get that older version. Save yourself a little bit of money if you would like. How long does policy paper usually range? Good question. Policy paper, usually you can do a good job of it in 7 to 10 pages. It's a relatively short paper. I'm not looking for a dissertation. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop reading at 10 pages. 7 to 10 just tends to be the normal, what I tend to see in this class. It's not a major research paper with only 10 sources, so I think 7 to 10 pages certainly should be sufficient. I never grade papers based upon the quantity. I always grade them based upon the quality, and so it's really going to depend upon the content of the paper more so than the length of the paper. Will links to the additional articles be under the appropriate week? Whenever I add additional articles, if I do, we'll put them under the appropriate week. But all the ones that you see that are listed, the Shafritz ones, those are all out of the classics text. So all the ones that you see in our course outline, those all appear in the Shafritz textbook. Double space, yes, I'm getting old, so please, my vision is going downhill very quickly. So double space, if you could, would be great. Again, a title page would be good. Don't forget your reference page, because I will be grading that, listing all your references in APA format. And again, as you start thinking about this policy paper, I know it's not due for quite a while, for 2 months, I guess. But as you start thinking about the policy or the program that you would like to use, by all means, feel free to send me an email, ask me about it. I'm happy to give you feedback as to whether or not I think the policy or program would work well. And if not, I can certainly give you some direction on how you can narrow it or maybe refashion it to make it work better for the paper. The basic requirement, though, is there is a policy or a program that has something to do with public administration or public policy, which covers pretty much the entire world. It's hard to find a program or policy that is not related to public administration. So it's really a huge spectrum, if you will, of policies and programs that you can certainly choose from. Good questions. Always a good time to ask them in this first class. And if a question occurs to you after we're done tonight that you didn't think to ask, feel free to bring it with you next week or shoot me an email, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you have. The rest of the syllabus, basically all the boilerplate information that you're going to see in all the syllabi that you will see in this program. So you can read through all that on your own, but that's kind of the meat and potatoes of the syllabus and the meat and the potatoes of the course. But what I would like to do now, let me stop my share and let me share out. It's still open. It doesn't appear to be. So let me share my screen, and I will go to our Canvas site. And okay, hopefully you're able to see the Canvas site. Yes? Okay, see some nodding, that's a good thing. So you've probably already been to the Canvas site, which is good. If you haven't been there yet, this is what it looks like. This is the student view, so this is basically what you should be able to see. And again, I've organized all the documents and everything you're going to be using by week. So you start out, you've got the welcome up there, you've probably already read. There's the instructional video on getting started with Zoom in case you need that. It seems like no one needs that because everyone's in tonight. Syllabus is there. The link is then there. I set up a recurring meeting, so we're going to be using the same link every single week and the same password. So there won't be any new links. It's all right there for you. Just use the same link every single subsequent week. Week number 1, syllabus again. Then I've got the slides for a discussion of American democracy that we're going to be doing in a few minutes tonight. Link there for the Articles of Confederation to take a look at. Link there for the Constitution that we'll spend some time talking about at the beginning of class next week. Amendments. Link to Federalist Papers. Partial list of public administration journals that I told you about. And then a link for your introduction posts. So let's click on there and just post right in there your introduction, ungrade it, and I'll take a look at that then before we get together next week. Week 2, you'll see you have the slides for accountability and ethics, and then the link to do your Canvas essay and responses to your colleagues. Week 3, for our discussion of the discipline of public administration, and so on and so on. So you got to get the idea. And when we are using additional resources, like in 2 weeks, when we're going to, like next week, when we're going to, well, actually that should be up. I'll move that up. In week 2, I'll move this up. But code of ethics, that should be moved up to week 2. That's there for you, so you can look at the code of ethics before you get together in class, so that you'll know what they look like before you start talking about them. And then each week, you can see everything is on there for you. So you can access things directly through there. If you want to access discussions individually, you can click on discussions. Then you can go ahead and access Canvas 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 there, as well as your introduction posts. If you want to access assignments directly, they're all there for you as well. So pretty easy to navigate, very much of a bare bones Canvas site, but it provides all the information, all the documents you need in order to be successful in the class. So I just want to kind of show that to you, and so you know how to get into Canvas and how to navigate around Canvas. Okay, let's go to our slides. Okay. Typically what I will do each night is, each session is, we'll split the session up into 2 sections. We'll have a first half, then we'll take about a 10 or 15 minute break, and then we'll do the second half of the class. Since we are going to be doing an abbreviated class tonight, let's just go ahead and jump into a discussion of American government. I think we can certainly do this in about half hour, 45 minutes, and then let you out early tonight so you can do your introductory post and kind of, ease into the new semester. One thing I will mention that I forgot to mention on the syllabus. I know in our earlier version of the syllabus, I had February 17th. I had that session marked as not being a live session. I thought I was going to have a conflict that night. It looks like I'm not going to have a conflict, and so it looks like we're going to be able to get in all of our Zoom sessions, as long as nothing interferes with it, everyone stays healthy. We'll be able to get through each week of our Zoom session. So we should be able to have class on February 17th after all. So I just wanted to mention that before I forgot. Okay, let's spend a few minutes talking about the foundations of American government. And again, we do this for a couple of reasons. One reason we do this is because being a department chair of a program for 10 years now, doing the admissions for my program, I know that folks come into MPA programs from a variety of different backgrounds. Some people come in as political scientists and have had American government. Some people come in as engineers. Some people come in with business backgrounds. Some come in with criminal justice degrees in psychology, sociology. In my program at Long Beach, we end up getting biology and chemistry majors. It's not terribly unusual for us. So I realize a lot of people come into this program with different undergraduate degrees. So it's important for us to kind of create a level playing field when it comes to an understanding of American government, American democracy, and what that means for running government agencies and for being public administrators. So that's one reason why we talk about this. The second reason why we spend time tonight talking about American government and American democracy is because it is so elemental to what we do as public administrators. As public administrators, we are interfacing with citizens, especially if we're a type of public administrator that Michael Lipsky refers to as a street-level bureaucrat. Lipsky says some administrators are street-level bureaucrats in that they interact with public on a daily basis. If you are interacting with citizens on a daily basis, you are held to a requirement that you know and do not violate the constitutional rights of the citizens that you deal with. We realize as public administrators that yes, we are administrators, but we are doing it in a political environment. We always say in public administration that we serve many masters, because as public administrators, we are held accountable for our actions to not only the public, but we're also held to account by members of legislatures. And so Congress can pull in federal bureaucrats for oversight hearings. State legislatures can pull in public administrators at the state level. City councils can pull in administrators. And so we really do serve these many masters in this political environment. So it's important for us to understand the political aspects of what we do as administrators. So again, I think there are a lot of good reasons why we talk about American government and the principles of American government in this first session. So there are two basic pillars. And again, if you're a political science major, this is all old hat to you, and I apologize for that. But if you haven't had American government in a while, this is important basic information for you to have. But as we know, our system of government is all about trying to limit power. There are two basic pillars of our system of American government: separation of powers and federalism. Separation of powers is the horizontal limitation of power by dividing power up among, as we know, our three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. So it's a horizontal separation of power. But we also have a vertical separation of power that comes to us through federalism. Federalism, as you know, is the separation of power between national and state governments. Now, under our original Constitution, it was just a separation of power between national and state governments. Local governments were not involved in that equation whatsoever. There's no mention of local governments in the Constitution. The only mention is national and state. But federalism is this vertical separation of power. So we separate power horizontally, and we also separate it vertically, again, for the purpose of trying to limit the power of government. We limit the power of government because we are a democratic republic. So we are both a democracy as well as a republic. Give me some examples or an example of how we are a democracy. What makes America a democracy? Anyway, go ahead.
We're able to vote.
Yeah, we participate in our own governance. We vote. And so we go out to the ballot box, we vote, we participate in our own governance. We participate in our own governance by voting elected officials, but we also can vote on issues as well. We're here in the state of California, and the state of California has one of the more permissive initiative processes in the country, where people can get together, and if they get enough signatures, they can force an issue onto the ballot to allow their fellow citizens to vote directly on that issue. When you go to vote here in California, you'll have all these different propositions on the ballot. Some of those propositions are because they're initiatives that people got together and got the requisite number of signatures and got the issue on the ballot to be voted upon. Some of those propositions are what we call referenda, in that the state legislature decides they're going to put an issue on the ballot and let people vote directly on that issue. So when we participate directly in our own governance, we are practicing democracy. We are a democracy. Power comes from the people. People participate directly in their own governance. Now, we know that not everyone participates in their own governance. And we know there are lots of different ways you can participate in governance. Voting is one of them. Contributing to candidates is another one. Working on a campaign is another one. Protesting and seeking a redress of your grievances is another. Talking about politics is another. There are lots of different avenues for us to participate in governance, but when we do participate, we are engaging in a democratic activity. Now, the reason why people tend not to participate in their own governance, and there are a variety of different variables that will lead people to not participate. One of the major determinants of whether or not someone participates is this idea of what's called efficacy. There are two different types of efficacy. There's internal efficacy and there's external efficacy. Internal efficacy is the belief on the part of a citizen that they can understand government. They can understand politics. They're able to understand the political process. So the more someone feels they understand the process, the higher level of internal efficacy they have, the more likely they are to go out there and participate. The other type of efficacy is called external efficacy. External efficacy speaks to the belief that your vote makes a difference, or your $100 donation to a candidate makes a difference. So if you feel your activity, your political action can make a difference in what happens in politics and what happens in government, then you have what's called external efficacy. People with high levels of internal and external efficacy tend to vote more than people with lower levels of internal and external efficacy. And again, there are a lot of correlates that will help us explain internal and external efficacy, education, income, all kinds of different determinants of whether or not someone will have high internal or external efficacy. But democracy is when we actually go out there and participate in our own governance directly. A Republican form of government, small r, Republican form of government, is obviously when we elect people to represent us. So we are also a republic in that we elect people to represent us in the U.S. House, in the U.S. Senate, in the Assembly here in California, in the Senate in California, in our city council, on our local school board. That's a Republican form of government. You elect people to go and then make decisions for you on your behalf. So we are a democratic republic. As a democratic republic, especially focusing on that republic aspect, as a democratic republic, we are electing people to go into government and make decisions for us. So what we are basically doing is we are ceding some of our authority and we are giving up some of our power to fellow citizens to go and make decisions for us in government. That's the idea of social contract theory. And if you were a political science undergrad, I'm sure you read Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan. I'm sure you've read John Locke and his second treatise on government. But a lot of our foundational aspect of our system of government, whether it be in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, a lot of that emanates from John Locke's work in his second treatise on government, where Locke made the argument of social contract theory, that since power comes from the people, and people decide what power and how much power to give up to government, they are entering into an agreement with their government. They're entering into a contract, a social contract with their government. That social contract says that people will give up power and rights to government, and then in exchange, government will use those powers judiciously to serve the interests of the public. So it's a contract, it is an agreement. Our whole system of government is predicated on this idea of social contract theory. We've had two contracts, if you will, in our history. Our first contract was our first constitution called the Articles of Confederation. And again, if you were an undergraduate political science major, you've probably read the Articles of Confederation. They're available for you to read again if you would like on our Canvas site. But to make a long story short, the Articles of Confederation, our first constitution, created a very weak national government. The vast majority of the power under the Articles of Confederation, this first contract between the people and their government, the vast majority of that power resided with the individual states and not with the national government. And giving a couple of examples out of the Articles of Confederation. One example of the weakness of the national government under the Articles is when you look at the very beginning of the Articles, it refers to the style of this confederation will be the United States of America. Capitalized, proper noun, United States of America. That is the only time in the entire Articles of Confederation that United States of America is capitalized as a proper noun. That's the only time you see it, the title. Every other time in the Articles, when we refer to the United States, it's usually lowercase and it says United States in Congress assembled. So throughout the rest of the articles, we refer to the United States as United States in Congress assembled. Well, what does that mean? The word Congress under the Articles of Confederation meant something different then than it means today for us. Today, we think about Congress and we think about the Capitol building. We think about the U.S. House. We think about the U.S. Senate. We think about these permanent institutions that have been there for over 200 years and will be there for hundreds of years in the future, hopefully. They're a permanent institution. In the Articles, the word Congress was not used as a permanent institution. The word Congress simply meant a meeting. So a meeting of the states. So when the article said United States in Congress assembled, that meant these states are united together when they are meeting together in Congress to make these decisions. So it's a much more temporary meaning to the idea of United States, not the proper noun that we think of it today. So that was one thing. Second thing in the articles is the articles refer to the states as being in a firm league of friendship. So it wasn't the United States. States are joining together for their own protection in this firm league of friendship. So again, a much looser type of alliance than what you would think about today with our current situation. The federal government consisted of one branch, essentially, a Congress, and that was a unicameral Congress, so a one-house Congress. Congress had very little authority except when it was meeting. So all the states would get together, they would meet in this Congress, in this meeting, they would make laws, they would make decisions, then they would pick their things up and go back home. But when they would go back home, there really wasn't any authority for the nation to act as a nation. Each individual state was acting on its own accord. So we had very little ability to raise an army. We had very little ability to coin uniform monetary. We had very little ability to do trade and to do treaties and all those things that have come very familiar with the national government today. So it's a very weak type of national government created under the Articles of Confederation. Well, those of you who are history students know the importance of what we call triggering events in history. Something will happen in history that will galvanize public opinion around the idea that a change needs to be made. And for history buffs, you're probably familiar with Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion, ring a bell with anyone? Yeah, Shays' Rebellion was this rebellion of farmers that was led by a retired Army captain by the name of Daniel Shays. So you had this retired Army captain that led a rebellion of farmers because farmers were losing their farms. They had no money to plant crops. They were rebelling to try and hopefully get some resources in order to be able to survive. It took days for Massachusetts to put down this rebellion of these farmers led by a retired Army captain. That, not in technical terms, but basically scared the heck out of a lot of people in the country. That if it took that long for us to put down a rebellion of farmers, what are we going to do if we are invaded by France? We're invaded by a foreign nation. So it really galvanized public opinion around, we need to make a change to the Articles of Confederation. Now, one of the problems of the Articles of Confederation is if you wanted to amend the Articles, the only way to amend the Articles was with a unanimous vote of all 13 states. So all 13 states had to agree to amend the Articles. Well, the best way to get them all to agree is to get them all together into a constitutional convention. So they all got together in what became known as the Constitutional Convention for the purpose of amending the Articles in order to strengthen the defense and to make it easier for us to defend ourselves against insurrection as well as invasion. So the Constitutional Convention started, again, not to make this into a history class, when the Constitutional Convention began, not all the delegates were there. We had poor road conditions. It took some delegates a while to get there. The delegates who arrived first at the Constitutional Convention were people like James Madison and James Madison's colleagues, who came to be known as the Federalists. They were the first ones to arrive at the Constitutional Convention. So they were able to get the ball rolling toward doing more than just amending the articles and perhaps actually replacing the articles with a new constitution. At the Constitutional Convention, we had three main disagreements. There were three main disagreements that the delegates had. The one main disagreement we had at the Constitutional Convention was the disagreement between large states and small states. States with a large population felt that they should be recognized for having a large population in terms of representation in Congress. They wanted proportional representation in Congress. Small states were concerned, obviously, that if large states got proportional representation, that small states would end up losing their rights. They would have to pay a lot more money to paying off the debts from the Revolutionary War. Small states wanted to have equal representation. So we had the Virginia plan, which was proportional representation. We had the New Jersey plan, which was equal representation. And we ended up with a compromise, which you probably all know, the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, which created a bicameral Congress, a House of Representatives based on proportional representation, and a Senate based upon equal representation. So that first disagreement between large states and small states was taken care of with that Connecticut Compromise. A second main disagreement between the delegates was from slave states versus non-slave states. The way in which the framers came to an agreement to try and mitigate that disagreement between the slave states and the non-slave states, the Three-Fifths Compromise, which you see in Article number 1 of the Constitution, as well as a prohibition against banning the slave trade until 1808. So clearly, they did not deal with that in the way in which they dealt with the first disagreement between large and small states. The decisions they made in order to deal with those disagreements between slave and non-slave states obviously still haunts the country today. But that's how they decided to compromise in order to deal with that disagreement. Then the third disagreement was between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Federalists like James Madison wanted a stronger national government. Anti-Federalists wanted power to reside with the states. They really believed in states' rights. The only thing that Anti-Federalists would agree to with this stronger national government is they did want a stronger national government for defense. But that's about all they would come into the Constitutional Convention agreeing to. The problem, again, was that the Anti-Federalists got there late. So the Federalists and James Madison were there first. They were able to get the ball rolling toward creating a much stronger national government and actually replacing the articles with a brand new constitution. And where Madison really carried the day in the Constitutional Convention is when he was able to get the Anti-Federalists to agree that they wanted more out of the new national government than just national defense. He was able to get them to admit that they wanted economic considerations from the new national government. They wanted a national government strong enough to be able to come up with a uniform currency and to get their debts repaid. When you think about the delegates of the Constitutional Convention, they all fit a certain profile. They were all white, they were all male, and they were all property owners. They were the creditors. They were the ones who had loaned money to make the Revolutionary War possible. They wanted to get their debts repaid. Madison effectively tapped into that desire to get debts repaid in order to get the Anti-Federalists to agree that the national government needed to provide some type of a stable economic situation so that those debts could be repaid. Once Madison was able to get them to admit that, then it was game over. The articles were dead, and they were going to be replaced by this new constitution, creating a much more vigorous and much stronger national government. If you're interested, we don't have time to go into it, but if you're interested in this whole idea of the role of economics at the Constitutional Convention, historian from many years ago, Charles Beard is his name, and he published a treatise called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And in his economic interpretation of the Constitution, he argued that the reason that we ended up getting a new Constitution was for economic reasons, and that these delegates who were the creditors, they wanted to get their debts repaid, and that's why they acquiesced to get this new Constitution. But again, fascinating argument, pretty controversial in history, and so we ended up having a whole discussion and debate about this in the field of history for many, many years. But I think it's hard to argue that there was some economic imperatives that were involved in the Constitutional Convention. So we end up getting this new Constitution. And again, we don't have time tonight to go through the Constitution, and you haven't really had a chance to review it. So I would ask that you take a look at the Constitution, and then we'll begin next week's class talking about the Constitution, actually going through the 7 articles and the 27 amendments in the Constitution to see how the Constitution really does frame what we do on a daily basis as public administrators. But again, this Constitution is the contract between people and their government that stipulates who has the power and where the power resides. So this whole Constitution is a compromise about power. So I think it's instructive for us in this class to really have a good conversation about the idea of power and what power is and what power isn't. I think we throw the word power around a lot, and we're very comfortable just talking about power. This person has power, that person has power. We really never get into a deconstruction of this idea of the term power. So let's do that. And one way I like to do that is by introducing you to a famous sociologist by the name of John Gaventa. His name is Gaventa, John Gaventa. And John Gaventa really was fascinated by the idea of power. And so being a good social scientist, he decided he was going to do an experiment with humans. So he decided to go into a coal mining town in rural Appalachia and answer the question, why do these coal mine owners have so much power over coal miners? And the idea was in this small town, coal mine workers were working 70 and 80-hour weeks. They were working in very dangerous mine conditions. And if you know anything about the world of coal mining, coal mines have this really nasty propensity for exploding. I mean, the gases get released and you have a flame and you have an explosion. And the coal mine owners didn't want to mitigate those safety concerns. There's a process that's been around for many, many years in coal mines called dusting. And when you dust the coal mine, you kind of tamp down the gases so there's less of a risk of explosion if there's an open flame. Well, dusting costs money. And so the coal mine owners didn't want to spend the money on dusting, so they didn't dust the mines. Coal mine workers knew the mines weren't being dusted. They knew there's a high probability of an explosion, but they continued to work in the mines anyway. The coal mine owners didn't pay the coal mine workers with cash, they paid them with tokens. The tokens are only redeemable at the company store. So the only store in town was owned by the coal mine, and the coal mine owners only accepted tokens. So you got paid in tokens, you took the tokens in, you bought what you needed in the company store. Everything goes back to the company. So what Gaventa wanted to know is, why were these coal mine workers accepting of this relationship with the coal mine owners? Why were the coal mine owners able to exert this much power over the coal miners? And his study really found 3 what he called different faces or types of power. So Gaventa argues there are 3 different faces of power. The first face of power is the least dangerous. And that's what I like to call overt power. So it's an obvious exercise of power. So power is basically when you influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. In overt power, you are influencing someone to do something they otherwise would not do, but both parties know what's going on. So the example when I used to teach classes in person, seems like a lifetime ago, is that the student gets their midterm exam back. They don't like the score they got on the midterm, and they come up behind me and push me out the window. That's overpower. They're forcing me to do something I otherwise would not do. I otherwise would not want to plummet to my death out of the third floor of this building, or I don't know if I die, maybe whatever, out of the third floor of the building. They're forcing me to do it. They're exercising power over me. Gaventa would say that's the least dangerous type of power because the person who's pushing me knows they're pushing me. I see him coming. I know that they're pushing me as well. Both parties know what's going on. So he would call that overpower the least dangerous type of power. The second phase of power is what he calls mobilization of bias. This is basically agenda setting. Now, if you've ever done any work in public policy, you know the importance of agenda setting. The ability to get an issue on a formal decision-making agenda is imperative to getting the policy that you want. In mobilization of bias, you keep issues off of the formal decision-making agenda. So the coal mine owners, through their contributions to the campaigns of members of the state legislature, were able to influence the state legislature to keep these coal mine safety issues off of the legislature's agenda. If it never gets on the agenda, there'll never be a law passed promoting coal mine safety. So they were able to exercise mobilization of bias, keeping issues off of the agenda. Coal mine workers just knew that no laws were being passed. They didn't know why. They didn't know the role that the coal mine owners had in setting the agenda for the state legislature. So this is more dangerous because it's more hidden. The coal mine workers didn't know what was going on. The third phase of power is the most dangerous, according to Gaventa. That's what he calls co-optation. In co-optation, one party co-opts the opinions of the other. So what basically happened is the coal mine owners were able to convince the workers that working 70-hour weeks in dangerous mine conditions and getting paid with tokens instead of cash, that all those things were in the best interest of the coal mine workers, when really they were not. They're able to take the opinions of the coal mine workers and replace them with what was in the best interest of the coal mine owners. That's the most dangerous type of power because the coal mine workers didn't know it was happening. They had no realization of what was happening. They really thought it was in their best interest to do all these things that benefited the coal mine owners. Why is this important? One of my favorite questions in all my classes is, so what? Okay, it's an interesting theory. It's a fun theory to talk about in retrospect. But so what? What does it mean for what we are doing? What it means for what we are doing is that this struggle over power runs through the entire field of public administration. And we're going to come back to this idea of power again and again. We're going to come back to it when we talk about managing fiscal resources, when we talk about organization theory, when we talk about accountability and ethics next week. In all of our topics, power will be an underlying theme in everything that we talk about. So what I hope you do is remember this Gaventa typology of these three different phases of power and be able to identify what type of power we are talking about when we talk about power. Are we talking about co-optation? Are we talking about agenda setting? What type of power are we dealing with? Because power is a multifaceted term. It's just not this monolithic influencing other people. There's more to power than just that. So hold on to this Gaventa typology because we're going to keep returning to it again and again in this class. And our system of American government really is predicated upon how do we divide up this power between different political actors as well as different levels of government. So keep that nuanced definition of power in mind for future classes. So we divide up power in American democracy horizontally through separation of powers. And as we said before, we also divide it vertically through our system of federalism. We tend to talk a lot more about separation of powers than we talk about federalism. And typically federalism is sometimes a lost topic, especially when we talk about policy. When we talk about policies, we usually talk about policies from who's being benefited by this policy. We look at the outcomes of the policy. we don't really look at the roles of government in terms of formulating and implementing these policies. We don't really look at federalism types of politics. That's not really one of our major concerns. But the argument is it should be, because this vertical separation of power known as federalism is really elemental to our entire system of American democracy. So federalism is a vertical separation of power between different levels of government. But one thing that we do know is over our 200 plus year history, federalism is a dynamic concept in that distribution of power between federal and state, and now today local governments, that distribution changes over time. And the distribution of power in 1789 looked a lot different than the distribution of power in 2021. So how has federalism, this vertical distribution of power, changed over the years? I would argue, and different federalism scholars will use different eras in their discussion, I would argue that we've really gone through basically 5, maybe 6 different eras of federalism, the distribution of power. The first era of federalism, I think you could argue, starts with 1789, starts with the founding of the nation, and goes through the Civil War, up through the beginning of the Civil War. So if you want to put dates on this, the first era really goes from 1789 up to 1861. And that first era of federalism, distribution of power, we usually refer to as dual federalism. It's called dual federalism because there was a distinct separation between the powers of the national government and the powers of state governments. So the national government had its sphere of influence, state governments had their spheres of influence, and there's a clear line of demarcation between the two spheres. National government did its thing, state governments did their thing. The sphere of influence of state governments during dual federalism was much larger than for national governments. So most of the responsibilities resided at the state level of government. And that was true up to the beginning of the Civil War. Now, this era of dual federalism, there is a model of federalism that fits this era. And that model of federalism is called a coordinate authority model. Coordinate authority model because one level of government had their responsibilities, the other one had their responsibilities. There was no overlap between the two. They were separate. They were coordinate authority models. And that's what we call dual federalism. Dual federalism persisted until the Civil War. So in the late 1850s and into the 1860s, as you know, southern states started disagreeing with a lot of the legislation that was being passed by Congress. Congress was passing legislation that southern states, because of their system of slavery, they felt that northern states were trying to usurp their power. They felt that Congress was being dominated by northern states. And so southern states decided just to stop following national laws. So Congress would pass a law, they would nullify that law. They say, we're just going to ignore it, we're not going to follow it. And then eventually, as you know, South Carolina then seceded from the Union, and more states followed, and we were then in the Civil War. Once the Civil War ends, we go into Reconstruction. Our system of federalism, our era of federalism, really switches from dual federalism to our second era, which is known as competitive federalism. Competitive federalism, you still had two different spheres of influence. The national government and the state government still had their own spheres of influence. The difference, though, was that the national sphere of influence increases and the state sphere of influence decreases. So in the era of competitive federalism, we see the national government taking on more and more power and more responsibility. We see the national government start to regulate interstate commerce. We see them start to regulate workplace safety, start regulating food safety, start regulating pharmaceutical drugs, start regulating all these different elements and aspects of the economy. And when it starts regulating all these different parts of the economy, that sphere of influence greatly grows for the national government. So it's still a coordinate authority model. It's just the national government becomes dominant over state governments in competitive federalism. But you still have that line of demarcation. Then the stock market crashes. Then you have the Great Depression. And you have FDR's response to the Great Depression, the New Deal. So once we get into the 1930s and the New Deal, we shift eras of federalism again. We move from competitive federalism into what's going to be known as cooperative or fiscal federalism. Some people call it cooperative, some like to call it fiscal. We then shift into cooperative or fiscal federalism. This is 1930s up until the 1960s. FDR's New Deal begins to give grant money to state governments to help state governments pull themselves out of the throes of the Great Depression. We start to see an overlapping of functions through the use of grant monies between federal and state governments. In cooperative federalism, we now move from the coordinate authority model to an overlapping authority model, where the functions of state and local governments, national and state governments start to overlap with each other. And we have that from the 30s into the 60s. We have all these new grant programs, all these new alphabet agencies being created at the federal level to, again, help states recover from the Great Depression. That takes us up into the 1960s. And the 1960s, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, we get Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson, when he becomes president, actually ushers in a new era of federalism that's called creative federalism. Johnson truly believed that the power for decision-making should reside at the national level. Decisions should be made in Washington, D.C. And then we provide incentives to get state and now local governments to carry out those national objectives. So we start using things like categorical grants to induce state and local governments to work toward achieving national objectives. We start using mandates or orders from the national government to require state and local governments to take certain actions to, again, further those national objectives. It's called creative federalism because the Johnson administration was creative in coming up with all these different types of grants and all these different types of mandates to induce and or force state and local governments to abide by these national priorities and objectives. Creative federalism introduces a third model to us, and that's called inclusive authority. In the inclusive authority model, the sphere of power and influence for the local government and state government is subsumed within the sphere of influence of the national government. So it's no longer that they are partially overlapping. Now the national sphere has completely gobbled up the state and the local sphere of influence, and state and local power now resides within the power of the national government. It's an inclusive authority type of model. Creative federalism didn't last very long. And when Nixon comes into office in 1969, he ushers in a new era of federalism known as New Federalism. Not exactly a creative name, no pun intended, but New Federalism. Nixon's New Federalism approach took creative federalism and completely turned it on its head. In creative federalism, Johnson believed that priorities and objectives should be established in Washington, D.C. Nixon believed that priorities and objectives should be established at the local government level, that who knows what's in the best interest of local citizens better than the local government itself. So he wanted to decentralize and devolve all that decision-making down to the local level of government. So again, New Federalism empowers local governments to make their own decisions and gives them a seat at the decision-making table. That was true of the Nixon administration. That was also very true of the Reagan administration as well. So the Reagan administration is kind of a revitalization of Nixon's New Federalism throughout the 1980s, and even with Bush into the early 1990s. Post-Clinton administration, where we are now in federalism, I would refer to as contextual federalism. in that our approach to the balance of power between national, state, and local governments really depends upon the issue itself. Federalism is no longer ideological like it used to be. Now it is issue specific. And it really gets to my favorite answer in all of my classes. So, my favorite question is, so what? My favorite answer is, it depends. That's going to drive you crazy, but it's true. It depends is my favorite answer. It depends upon the situation. Well, here in contextual federalism, the balance of power really does depend upon the issue that we are dealing with. And you can look at different administrations. Take the Clinton administration. Clinton administration on an issue such as, we'll say, blood alcohol content levels, for drunk driving. The Clinton administration wanted every single state to have the same blood alcohol content level, a 0.08 blood alcohol content level for drunk driving. Now, the Constitution does not provide the national government explicitly any power over establishing blood alcohol content levels. There's nothing in the Constitution about that. What the Clinton administration wanted to do is it wanted to use some coercive mandates in order to force state governments to adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. Specifically, what they would do is they would take highway money away. So if you don't want to adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level, you're going to lose your highway funds. You're going to lose federal highway funds. So in that respect, the Clinton administration is very much of a top-down, centralized type of an approach. But compare that to the Clinton administration's approach with welfare reform. Clinton administration worked with Republicans in Congress to institute welfare reform that was very much of a bottom-up approach that provided more block grants to states and gave states a lot more flexibility in how they implemented welfare programs. So on one side, on one issue, it was very centralized, top-down, kind of like a creative federalism. On another issue, like welfare reform, it was much more like Nixon and Reagan's new federalism. Bush administration. Look at the George W. Bush administration, same type of idea. On some issues, or in fact, the majority of issues, it was very much of a bottom-up, empower state and local governments, and very much of a new federalism type of approach. But then think about No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind was much more of a top-down type of an approach, whereby we would set standards and we would set targets for state governments to meet. And if they didn't meet those targets, they would lose federal money. So more creative federalism when it came to education. You can see the same thing in the Obama administration. And so really what has happened is our definition of who should have the power between our different levels of government really depends upon the context of the issue today, more so than the ideological perspective of the party holding power. So today, I think we're really much more in that contextual type of an arrangement. Well, so what? What does this discussion of the development of federalism mean for us as public administrators? Well, again, we serve many masters. And a lot of the programs that we are implementing, they could be federally funded with a pass-through from the state that are locally administered, which means that we are dealing with 3 different levels of government in implementing that program or that policy. Depending upon the program, perhaps the federal government, when it gives us that funding, it also gives us a lot of rules and regulations that we have to follow, which means it's a very top-down type of administration. For some other programs, federal government gives money with a pretty much hands-off type of an approach, and local governments can then decide how they spend that money. So how the balance of power resides, if you will, on a given policy or given program will have a big impact upon us as public administrators as we implement and administer those same programs. So it's important as public administrators for us to understand this balanced power, not just horizontally between different branches of government, but also vertically between different levels of government as well. Well, the big so what? Well, what does separation of powers and federalism mean for us as public administrators in the field of public administration? Well, I think the number one theme that we take away from separation of powers and federalism is this serving of many masters. That again, we serve executive, legislative, and judicial at the federal and at the state and at the local level. So we have to serve many masters. What does serving many masters mean? It means that we get a lot of conflicting direction. We may get one set of direction from the executive and a separate set of directions from the legislature. We may have the federal government tell us one thing and state and local governments tell us something else. So we have a lot of different and conflicting direction, which creates a complex network of cooperation and competition in which we need to operate. Our networks are complex. Not only, again, are we dealing with federal, state, and local, and executive, legislative, and judicial, we're also sometimes dealing with nonprofit organizations and private organizations as well. Today, we have seen the advent of governing networks where public organizations and public administrators must interact effectively, again, with nonprofit administrators as well as businesses and business leaders. So there's a whole complex network of cooperation and competition that we have to navigate. The conflicting direction, the complex networks of cooperation and competition give us a unique environment of public administration. And I'll introduce you to a very famous public administration theorist by the name of John Gauss, G-A-U-S. John Gauss is best known for his theory known as the ecology of public administration. Gauss argues that if we want to understand what a public organization does and why it does what it does, and we want to understand public administrators and their behaviors and motivations, we first need to understand the environment, the ecology in which they operate. He actually likened a public organization to a living plant. He said, if you want to understand why a plant grows the way in which it does, you have to understand its environment, the amount of sunlight it gets, the amount of fertilizer it gets, the amount of water it gets, its placement in the house. Some people say the amount of time you talk to it. All those parts of the environment have an impact upon how that plant grows. Gauss says it's the same thing with public organizations. To understand a public organization, we need to understand its complex environment. And one of our major goals in this class over the next several weeks will be to kind of tease out that environment of public administration and talk about the impacts and the influences that the environment of public administration has on the behaviors of public administrators and the behaviors of public organizations. It is a unique environment. It's an environment that's much different than a private sector organization has, but it's an environment that we must maintain a good understanding of in order to understand truly why administrators and why organizations do what they do. Our environment is a very political one. Despite the whole politics administration coming to us from Woodrow Wilson, we understand that there really is a blurring of the lines between the political world and the administrative world. We as public administrators must move adeptly within both the administrative as well as our political environment. So that's just kind of a little introduction to American government and why American government, understanding of American government is so important for what we are studying in public administration. Now, this level is kind of at the esoteric level. As we drill down in upcoming weeks, we will get into the specifics of what our political environment means for how we manage people, how we manage money, how we organize our organizations, how we develop policies and programs, how we implement them, pretty much everything that we do in the world of public administration. So I've talked a lot. That tends to happen on the first night when we present this information. I apologize for that. In subsequent weeks, I will talk a lot less and you will get to talk a lot more. I'm sorry that I missed a few things in the chat. Every now and then when I share my screen, my chat goes away, which I don't really know why it does, but it does. So I see a lot of people are saying voting in terms of democracy and a republic. You have the text chat in which you can participate each week. You also have microphone. You are very welcome to, whenever I ask questions or if you have comments or observations, to open up your microphone and share those, because the more you talk, the less I have to talk, and that's always a good thing, especially for you. So I think that wraps up pretty much what I want to present tonight. Do you have any questions about the course or any basic things as we start to get going here in week one? Well, you got me here. Any questions you'd like to ask? While I take a drink and try and see my voice. Okay. Well, what we will do then is, again, we'll have an early night tonight. It's about 8 o'clock, so we'll wrap up a little early. Next week, we'll start out with the Constitution. And I would ask that you look through the Constitution, because I do want to go through the Constitution and really pull out those elements that are important for us as public administrators. That if we do the Constitution, then we'll spend the rest of our time talking about accountability and ethics in the public sector, and why public sector ethics are so different than what we oftentimes run into in the private sector. By next Tuesday, if you go ahead and put your introduction into the introduction form, I'll go ahead and take a look at those. All the ones that have already been posted, I'll look at those between now and next Wednesday. There is a good question in the text chat. Do we have access to the class recording? Yes. These sessions are being recorded, and so what I will do is I will, once we're done here, I will extract the video. And it's one of the flaws of Zoom, quite honestly, is how long it takes for the video to download. So for a 2-hour class, I did a 2-hour class on Monday night. It took 2.5 hours for the video to download. So sometime tonight it will download. And when it does download, I'll go ahead and put it in our Canvas site. I'll put it under a link for underneath week 1. I'll have Zoom recording for January 27th. I'll put it right in there. You click on that. You can go back and watch this anytime throughout the week that you would like. So yes, every week will be recorded and available for you. Also, that means that you're very welcome, obviously, to be here every Wednesday. I encourage you to, but I don't take attendance. I don't grade on attendance. And so if you're not able to be here on a Wednesday night for some other obligation, I totally get that. The recording is available to you. You can go watch the recording if you can't be here. And if you have any questions after watching the recording, you're always welcome to shoot me an email, and I can help clarify anything that needs to be clarified. Should we only read the Constitution or amendments to? Good question. I've got both links there. If you just click on the Constitution link, the Constitution includes all the amendments. And so that one document will give you all 7 articles as well as all 27 amendments to the Constitution. So just the Constitution link will certainly suffice. Okay. Very good. Any other questions? It's been nice kind of meeting you. I know we'll get to know each other hopefully a little bit better as we go through the next few weeks, but thank you for being here tonight. I'll have the recording ready to go sometime later tonight, and I look forward to talking to you again next Wednesday. So take care and have a good remainder of your week. Talk to you soon.
All right. Have a good night.